speakers. It is sometimes amazing the wonderful gems that you find right in front of you. And like many young men growing up, I was clueless of the many people in our area that are amazing. While I was on my mission, we had another amazing person move into our particular area, and that would be Arnie Farron. Now, for many people, the word Arnie Farron evokes a great deal of awe and respect. And sadly, I came back from my mission and I didn't really know who Arnie Farron was, but I have learned a great deal over the time. And probably the thing I need to tell you the most about Arnie Farron is he is truly one of the warmest, nicest people I have ever met. And I really do mean that. In addition to that, he has had some remarkable accomplishments in his life. And we'll learn a little bit more about that tonight. Our speakers will be Arnie's son, Trace Farron, and Arnie's grandson, which will be Trace's son, Josh Farron. And we're very grateful to have Trace and his wife Sherry with us, as well as Josh and his wife Tara. Trace currently is a physical therapist. He works for Intermountain Healthcare up in Ogden, close by McKay Hospital. Josh works for the Deseret News and is an artist for them. They grew up hearing pieces of this remarkable story about a 1944 NCAA championship and the incredible experience of these kids somehow getting this championship. Arnie went on through other teams with the University of Utah to win the NIT, and then went on to play professional basketball as well. But that story kept coming out about that whole championship team. Recently, in the last few years, Josh particularly was inspired to want to write this story down. And so Josh and Trace started to unravel the miracle story of the Blitz Kids and their road to the 1944 championship. It is incredible. I will tell you that sitting tonight at the Arnie family reunion table was a wonderful experience for me. I learned a lot of great things. We did learn that you can live with somebody your whole life and not know really what happened and not know the story. And Trace was telling me that one of the great advantages and blessings of writing this book is knowing and learning the story. And Josh went on to say that if there's nothing more than the ability to share this experience now with others and with their family, then the writing of this book has been very worthwhile. I think you will be very interested in hearing the story of the Blitz Kids. Please give Trace and Josh a hand.
And it's been a delightful journey. It was 68 years ago next month that this story happened. 1944, the United States was embroiled in a horrible war with battles going on in Europe, the Pacific, where lives were being lost. And this story takes place just 3 months before D-Day, when the forces of the free world are going to gather together at Normandy, France. And the names Utah Beach and Omaha Beach become words that are known to everybody. This story is remarkable in many ways. Soldiers in the battlefield, in their barracks, turned in radios to listen to the final game, the Dartmouth game, the championship game. And it's interesting to think, as you hear the story, or if you have a chance to read the book, there must have been the basketball gods someplace, smiling down on this group of 18-year-olds, one 19-year-old and one 20-year-old, who came together in 1 year at the University of Utah and pulled off something that a writer in Philadelphia, just who recently reviewed our book, says it is one of the most dramatic events in sport history. And it's not just important to us as a family, but he says it's important in the history of sport. It is so dramatic. I didn't understand this until we started researching and writing the book. It's one of the most seminal events in the history of the University of Utah, not because It's about a national championship because we've won plenty of those. We're now in the Pac-12, the Conference of Champions, but because of the story. And that's what makes it unique. And a wonderful, wonderful story that we're excited to share. We didn't write this book to sell a book. We wrote this book to tell a story that everyone needs to know. If you're a sports fan or if you're a fan of history, it's a wonderful story. Let me turn time over to Josh to do a little bit of an introduction, talk about the story, and Josh will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting us to be here tonight. It's thrilling for us to have the opportunity to share this story with you. And when it comes down to it, that's where this all came from. There was one night I was living in Reno, Nevada, working for a newspaper there. Being the grandson of Arnie Farron and growing up in Utah, I would go into class and the teachers would look at their rolls and they would say, Josh Farron. And they would, of course, say, are you related to Arnie? And being a tall man, Arnie casts a very long shadow. And unfortunately for me, I couldn't dribble the ball if you paid me. And having grown up, looking up to Arnie, there was one night when my wife and I were watching a basketball movie, something we had rented. And I got up in the middle of the night to take care of our son, Oliver, who was a newborn at the time. And I had this impression in my mind that that movie I had just watched was pretty good, but I didn't think it was as good as Arnie's. And Arnie's story had never been written about. It had never been made into a film. And in that, have you ever been consumed by something, an idea, something that you couldn't let go of? You had to just follow it. Well, in that night, I put my son to bed, and I closed myself in the bathroom with the light on, and sat down and started writing. And a lot of what I wrote that night is in the prologue of the book today. I knew I would never pick up a basketball and win a championship, but I knew that I could be the one to tell this story and capture it for my children, to learn about people who loved the game because it was a game, not because of million-dollar contracts and sponsorships. And I also knew that I would need help. I'm pretty good at coming up with great ideas, but I knew that I, not being an expert on basketball, would need some help along the way. I called my dad the next day and I said, I've got this crazy idea. Let's write a book together. And as odd as it seems, I felt like I saw the end from the beginning. I saw this book. And I had this nagging feeling it would become a movie, and we did sell the movie rights to the book. And that vision of being able to take that book and hand it to my children and say, learn, read about the things that they did, drove us along 4 or 5 years since that time when we started. Go ahead and read the slide. It's not just Arnie's story, though. One of my favorite parts of writing this book was learning about his teammate, Walt Masaka. And some of you may have seen him in the news recently with Linsanity and all this interest in the player from the Knicks. People are remembering the first minority to play in professional basketball, first Asian American, Walt Masaka. He's a quiet, unassuming engineer who still lives in Bountiful, and he grew up in Ogden. And Providence brought him to an opportunity that he still, he's not looking for the limelight, but he made history as one of the shortest people to play professional basketball and the first minority ever. Go ahead and next slide. Like Arnie, Watt grew up in Ogden, but Watt grew up on 25th Street, and you're probably all familiar with Ogden. In the 20s and 30s, when he grew up there, though, it was a different place. It was a red light district, and there were rumors of tunnels underneath the streets where there were opium dens and ladies of the night and all that sort of stuff. And Watt grew up on that picture right there, on the third section of the building, his dad bought a barber shop from a Greek immigrant, his father who emigrated himself from Japan. And in the dugout basement, they made a home. He grew up there, was friends with all the people on the street, and in a very hostile environment. But he was born kind, and he watched out for the other children. He took care of them. He saved up his dimes to buy them comic books for Christmas. And when his own father died when he was 13, he helped to support his family. His mother actually wanted to go back to Japan. She didn't speak English very well. She didn't know how to cut hair. But Watt said, "I'm not going. You can go back to Japan. I'm going to stay here." And she, of course, stayed with him and his brothers. And she learned how to be a barber, and she taught herself by cutting her children's hair. But he had a love of sports. In spite of his small frame, he was quick and determined, and he was strong. He spent his summers working in orchards, working in the barber shop, and playing ball. He played in Japanese leagues in Ogden. You'll see some videos later on, he was buff. He was really quick and was a fierce defender in basketball, but he was fair. And he tried to never commit a foul in basketball if he could help himself. And he was most of the time successful. Watt was on the Ogden High State Championship basketball team, the only Ogden High basketball championship team, and played for Weber State for a few years and was named the MVP of their conference before he transferred to the U. He was one of the older members of the Blitz Kids. And you can see him in the bottom corner. Second one from the right corner in that picture, that's from his days on the Weber State team. One of his childhood friends, Roy Yoshioka, who grew up with him on 25th Street, his family moved to San Francisco. And when the war broke out, the government decided to take Japanese Americans from California, Washington, and Oregon, and other areas, and bring them to camps. Over 100,000 American citizens were interred in camps throughout the United States. And one of them was Watt's good friend, Roy Yoshioka. And Watt took it upon himself to find a job, find a sponsor, find people to write letters so that Roy could get out of the camp and go find a life for himself. Go ahead and hit the next slide. And I'm going to turn the time over to my father, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of the team.
Arnie was born in 1945. 1925, and was raised in Ogden. And he was just a small child when his mother passed away. And his father was a businessman and traveled a lot, and not having the aptitude to be a single parent over the time, he turned the rearing of my father over to his parents, Ida and CP, and who raised him as if they were his parents, their child, and loved him and provided a home for him that his mother would have wanted for him. One of the things that I found out, I had always assumed that Dad maybe had a sad life because he didn't have a mother and he had a father who was gone a lot. And talking with him, he finally called me back one day and he said, you know, talking about this, he said, I've realized I had a wonderful childhood. And that was insightful to me to know that he felt loved, and that was important for me to know. In the 9th grade, he was 6'4" tall. And you would think you would be a natural on the basketball team, but he tried out in junior high school and he didn't make it. Can you imagine the coach kicking himself? He got cut. Later on in the year, that coach retired to do some other things, some business things in Ogden, and the school hired a fellow by the name of Bill Kinner, who was a former All-American at the University of Utah. Came to coach Arnie, and it was his first experience being really coached by someone who knew the game. Arnie did well his first year in junior high school. Second year, there was this beautiful little co-ed who invited Arnie to go skiing. And one of the rules a coach has for your athletes is, don't go skiing. Well, Arnie went skiing and he got caught in the rope tow and hurt his knee. And the championship game, Arnie was on the bench on crutches and they lost that game. His senior year first year in high school, good team. Arnie was a starter, all-stater that year, but they were beaten early in the state tournament. Second year in high school, best team in the state beyond a shadow of a doubt. Lost one game in the region. They were gathered together in the locker room following the region championship, and the high school coach came into them and said, I just got a phone call from the state. Because of the gas restrictions, the state tournament has been canceled. So he never got to play for a state championship, which, you know, for a young man, that's an important thing. And so life moved on. He figured that he had been in ROTC in high school and wanted to serve his country. When he graduated, went down to sign up, and because of his knee injury, they told him he was 4F and didn't qualify. So without much else to do, he thought, I'll go to school at the U. And he had taken a letter from his high school coach, high school counselor. He said, I have a brother who teaches at the U, who coaches at the U. His name is Vadel Peterson. Maybe you should stick your head in and say hello. Arnie took this letter, walked into Vadel's office, and there was Vadel Peterson, who is a massive man and not the most friendly man. Said, I'm Arnie Farron. I'm here to play basketball. And Vadel barely recognized him and told him if he wanted to play ball, go sign the note on the corkboard, on the bulletin board in the hallway, and if he had his own shoes, he could play. There was rubber restrictions, and the university couldn't buy shoes for their players. And so you had to have your own shoes. Times have changed. Would you push the button? The university administration that year, it was unique because all of the teams in the conference had disbanded their athletic teams for the year. Rubber restrictions and gas restrictions. They couldn't afford, they couldn't get the gas to compete. But the university had decided they wanted to put a basketball team on the floor. No teams in the conference to play. The Army had requisitioned the Iron Nielsen Fieldhouse and filled it with barracks, so they didn't have a place to play. So they had no teams to play, no place to play. So the university told them they could play their games in the girls' gym, which was in the dance building, small gym. Keith Brown, that Josh mentioned, was the team manager, and Vadel said to him, it's your job to find us teams to play. Skyline Conference said, you are not allowed to play other than college teams. Well, there were no college teams. The only other teams were military teams and semi-pro teams. And the conference said you can't play them. So they're in a quandary. They're entering into the season, and their schedule is blank. They don't have anybody to play. So they decided to defy the conference rules and started scheduling military teams, semi-pro teams. They almost lost their first practice game of the season to East High School. If it wasn't for a last-second shot, East High School would have beaten them in the girls' gym. It didn't start off very well. So finally, Keith was able to wrestle up some games with some military teams from some of the local bases. Now, you think about that, and it doesn't sound impressive, but when you realize that those military teams were stocked with former college players, former professional players, and former All-Americans, the competition was really good. They started beating these teams, many of them, most of them. And so all of a sudden, their schedule filled up. Everybody wanted to play this young team of freshmen with one sophomore and one junior to see if they could get a piece of them. And they kept beating them. They needed another place to play, so they rented the Deseret Gymnasium in downtown Salt Lake. Now, if you've ever been in there, if you'll remember, above the basketball floor was a suspended track. And the deal was, if you shot from the corner, you couldn't hit the basket because it would hit the bottom of the track. And so it was a unique situation, and one that they've made the very best out of. Vadel played 5 players most of the time. So those who made the team, if you weren't one of the starters, you rarely played. So one game I just want to mention, it kind of illustrates the point. The only road games they had during the conference, not really conference, but during the regular season, was to Colorado and Wyoming. They played a team from Fort Warren in Wyoming. On this team was a fellow by the name of Jules Rivlin. He was in the military, he'd been drafted. His last year in college, he was the leading scorer in the nation, an All-American. They also had a player by the name of Ermer Robinson, who had played 1 year for the Globetrotters. And after his service to the country, he went back and played for 13 more years with the Globetrotters and had an outstanding career, and was one of their stars. So here comes Utah along with their bunch of freshmen, playing these players who are not good players, but outstanding players. And going into the third quarter, Utah's leading the game. Foul shots, foul trouble. They end up losing the game 51-49 in a real battle. And it was one of the 3 losses they had that year. The last game of the season was there was a dance festival at the Deseret Gym, so they had to go rent another high school gym to play their last game of the season. So it was an unusual season as far as that is concerned. Let me turn the time over to Josh for just a second to address a couple of other things.
We could keep you guys here for hours. Some of the other members of the team you might be interested in. There was another Japanese American on the team, Mas Tatsuyo. Most of the people here did not go, most of them did go on the trip back to New York. Some of them would come and go. T. Ray Kingston was on the team. Bill Pizza was on the team. And there was another player on the team who will remain nameless, who was kicked off the team because he was caught smoking. We have over there Dick Smewen, who was, as you may say, he was the only person with a scholarship. The reason he got a scholarship, as we've come to learn, was because he probably couldn't afford it to go to college otherwise. He lived in Magna, and it took him hours to get to and from school every day. As a child, his father sent him out to the chicken coop. His father was a faithful member of the LDS Church and was opposed to gambling, but one of the only ways he could make ends meet was by raising chickens for cockfighting. And so these mean little birds lived in their backyard, and he would send his son out there and lock the door until he came out with one of the fighting cocks in his hand. He had to keep his knees bent. He had to keep his feet nimble. And he had the scars on his hands from those cocks for the rest of his life. But he was quick. And you can say that that love of basketball was in his blood. We have a pair of twins, Bob and Fred Lewis, who were lovers of sport and tennis and came together to play for the team. Herb Wilkinson, who ended up winning taking the winning shot, that you'll see later on, who was also on the team. And Coach Peterson, that Trace mentioned a little bit, has the most victories of any coach in Utah's history. And as you can see him in the back left corner, was not a real cuddly guy. He was very stern and was unwielding in his expectations of his players. His brother was a well-known football player who went by the name of the Terrible Swede because he refused to play football with a helmet on. A ragtag bunch. The only person who was recruited was Herb, and that meant he got a phone call from Vadel inviting him to come play. In a day and age when we have so many scholarships, so much spent on recruiting players and all the announcements, these were all a bunch of kids who lived near the university and showed up there. They weren't in the Army because they were either hurt and couldn't go in, or they were doctors, like pre-med or pre-dental. And Vadel lovingly referred to, not so lovingly referred to them as eggheads. And that was, that's what he expected to make the team of. Do you want to talk about Fred? Or Sheffield?
Yeah, go ahead and finish.
The other player that I'm going to mention really quickly is Fred Sheffield, who was the team captain. He played the year before, and was a great person to have on the team because he had an incredible ability to jump very high. He was the NCAA champion in high jump, and even though he was only 6'1", they started him because he could out jump anybody and get the ball at the first bell.
Which one is Sheffield?
Sheffield, he's got the curly hair. Let's see.
29 next to Valen, I think.
Yeah, right here. And there's Arnie, and the Lewis brothers, and Herb, and Watt is right here.
Was Wagner on that team?
Widener was on the 47 team. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So, I'm going to read you a little excerpt from the book. Vadel gave the university what it wanted, a basketball team. They had no home, no conference, and no one to play. Circumstances had forced them to start players who were young, gangly, and inexperienced. In normal circumstances, most of them would have had a permanent seat right in the pine. It wasn't much of a team, and the boys didn't look too promising on the court, but he was proud of what he'd cobbled together. Not unlike Dr. Frankenstein stitching together his creation out of the only things he was able to dig up. Vadel tried to put the spark of life in them. He didn't know it at the time, but he too had created a monster. Go ahead, Tara. Have we talked up to the, do you want to talk any more about the season?
I'm just going to talk about the trip to back to
Great.
So, following the season, Vadel walks in the locker room after the last game, and he has 2 envelopes in his hand. He said, "Boys, sit down. We have a decision to make." He said, "We have an invitation to go to the NIT tournament in New York. We also have an invitation to go to the NCAA tournament in Kansas City." And Arnie and Fred Sheffield were the only two who had been probably out of the state, but both had been to New York. Vadel wanted to go to New York, and there was a financial benefit to going back to play in the NIT. They wanted to see the Empire State Building. They wanted to see the Statue of Liberty. So every member on the team said, "Let's go to the NIT. Let's go to New York City. Let's go play in Madison Square Garden." And so the team met early in the morning, the train station, and because of the concern about shoes and jock straps, Vadel said, "Boys, give me your shoes and your jock straps. We're going to put them in this foot locker, and I'm going to be in charge of them, because once we get back there, we can't get any more. And I don't want you to lose them, because if you lose them, you can't play." So Vadel took possession of the shoes and the jock straps. So they get to Chicago. They've been on the train, a couple of days, playing bridge. Arnie and Watt just scalping the Lewis twins, cheating. They could see their hands in the mirrors behind them. So they get to Chicago to change trains to finish the trip into New York. And they're in a hurry, so Vadel takes his trunk, with the shoes and the jock straps. And in his rush, he leaves it at the train station. So they get to New York City, no shoes and jock straps. It's Vedel's fault. So if you can imagine, they've got a game against Oklahoma, a practice game. Well, they had to borrow shoes and jock straps from another team, to play the game. And finally they were able to find them. They caught up with them and they got their shoes and jock straps back. But for the game, they had to use borrowed ones. During the game, Fred Sheffield, probably the best athlete on the team, and I say that with respect to my father, but he probably was, jumps against Bob Curlin, who was 7-foot center for the University of Oklahoma. He comes down and he lands on his foot. And he twists his ankle and he sprains it badly, to the point that he can't play. Now, remember, Vedel only played 5 players, and his center is just injured. And what is he going to do? They pack it with ice, they try and get him ready, but they've got the University of Kentucky coming up. Fred is injured. During the game, now remember, the Utes have been playing at the Deseret Gym. It holds 2,500 players. They walk out onto the court. Madison Square Garden holds 17,000 people, and it's full. It's full of smoke. These guys haven't experienced smoke much coming from Utah, and it's a little overwhelming to them. Come onto the court to start the game, and Fred, first few times up and down the floor, trying to go with his sprained ankle, it becomes obvious that he can't. He can't go, he can't play, he can't move. So Coach Peterson looks down the bench. Next substitute is Watt. Watt's 5'7". So Watt gets substituted as center on the team. And they're playing the University of Kentucky. So, Utah takes the lead. At halftime, it's 24-24. And the fans who haven't heard much about Utah are so inspired by Watt's tenacious play, they're standing and cheering for him. These kids who didn't stand a chance. Third quarter, we found this in a newspaper article, and Dad doesn't remember this. Arnie's running down the floor, takes a pass to go in for a layup, comes down on that knee and twists it, and it locks. So he gets hauled off to the locker room, and is able to come back during the fourth quarter and continue to play. But it's too late. The Utes don't play well, they don't shoot well, and end up losing to Kentucky, which has happened many times since then. They lose 46-38. And it's a one and done. They've just been beaten out of the NIT. It's time for them to go home. Let me have Josh tell you a little more of the story now. It's interesting.
Several of these young men were headed off into the service, to go off into war. And they were looking forward to their last hurrah, seeing the sights, enjoying New York. Their season was over. But they didn't know their fates were about to change. That night, Vedel and the graduate manager, Keith Brown, were walking the streets of Manhattan, letting off steam for letting themselves get their hopes up. When Keith Brown spotted something sticking out of the snow, and he picked it up, and it was a little Bible. And he looked at Vedel and he said, "Look at that. I found a Bible. Isn't that good luck? Doesn't that mean something good is going to happen? It's a sign." And Vedel said, "Yes, it's a sign that there's someone walking around Manhattan looking for their Bible." Pushed a little button, Tara. They returned to the hotel. Keith kept that little, oh, there we go, you're good. Kept that Bible. And we had heard about this Bible and we didn't know if it existed, but we found it in the University of Utah archives. They go back to the hotel and there's a telegram waiting for them. from the NCAA tournament. And for them, it was an opportunity, but for another team, it was a tragedy. The University of Arkansas was headed to the NCAA tournament. And after practice game, their starting five loaded into a car and headed back to Arkansas, to their hometown, when they had a flat tire. It was rainy. The shoulder was so filled with mud that they were worried their car was going to get stuck, so they stopped right on the side of the road. And two of the starters got out and helped the assistant coach or one of the traveling faculty to change the tire, and were loading it into the back of the car, while one of their teammates, a new recruit, George Koch, was standing back there waving cars around, when a car appeared over the hill and barreled down on them. And George only had time to shout at his friends before diving out of the way, and he heard a horrendous sound. The car didn't brake, it didn't stop until it crashed into the back of the car where the two starters and the faculty member were standing. Ben, and this is Dino Nichols, who was a ball hawk, the star of the team. They both had compound fractures. And the assistant coach, or the faculty member died at the hospital. Dino had to have his leg amputated. And that's his wife standing next to him in the hospital as he's being presented with his Letterman's jacket a few days later with Coach Eugene Lambert. It's a small town, and they didn't know how to handle things quite correctly and hadn't dealt with something like this before. And gave his amputated leg to the coach and asked him to bury it. And in some ways, it must have felt like burying the dreams that he had for his team and for his players, like every coach has. They go beyond basketball, but are the hopes and dreams you have for their lives. And Dino never quite recovered. Although he would heal, he would never be the same. And they withdrew from the tournament. And that letter was waiting for them at the hotel. For the team members, for Arnie and for Herb and for Watt, to hear they had another chance. It was a rather simple matter. Vadel was a little hesitant. He thought we should enjoy New York while they'd have to go back to Kansas City. Cut our trip short, and if we lose in Kansas City, it's over. We don't get to see the sights. But they wanted their second chance. So they loaded up on the train and headed back out to Kansas City. Oh yeah, go ahead, the next one. This is a little video from a few years back. Talks a little bit with some of the players of the Arkansas team. I think you need to click right on it and it'll start playing. Hopefully you'll hear it. We've got it. It's okay.
While denying it to Arkansas.
Allied forces overseas continue to stand up to the Imperial Army's might. Under General Douglas MacArthur's command, our troops continue to make grand advances in the Philippines. From everyone back home, go get 'em, boys! Here in the States, the annual National Invitational Basketball Tournament kicked off in New York City. The University of Kentucky struck by the University of Utah in the opening round at Madison Square Garden. But everyone took notice that the Blitz Kids from Utah put up a pretty good scrap.
Oh yeah, we followed it. We followed to see what was going on.
Time it was, and what a time it was, a time of innocence, a time of confidences.
But Utah's 1944 basketball story would continue. A tragedy took place in Arkansas that would dramatically alter Utah's basketball plans and would forever change my life. Their story and my story are very different, and as you are about to find out, they're the same.
An automobile tragedy forces the University of
And this journey Once again, we all celebrate Utah's Cinderella story, but now you finally have the chance to hear mine.
Utah was later given the opportunity to face St. John's, that year's NIT champion, in a game played for charity. Utah won that one too. Coming up next, Clark's conversation with a pair of...
Following, we're going to kind of wrap this up quickly, we're running out of time, but following the meeting in the room, and just prior to this, Utah hopped back on the train, went to Kansas City where they beat Missouri and Iowa State. In fact, the interesting thing was they didn't reserve them a hotel room in Kansas City because they didn't think they would win. They told them to just place their suitcases in the room, that after the game, they'd be heading back to Utah. Well, they stayed and they stayed. And then they went back to New York, and the outcome is obvious. 2 nights later, after the Dartmouth game, winning the NCAA championship, Madison Square Garden hosted what was called the Red Cross Benefit Game to support the Red Cross in their war effort. It was the largest game ever attended, basketball game ever attended up to that time, and they raised $35,000. And in that game, Utah beat St. John's, the NIT champion, to win this mythical national championship. St. John's had beaten Kentucky in the NIT. So indirectly, they got a little revenge. Interesting things have happened to the team. I just want to mention briefly, Arnie, you know, 2008 was named to the Basketball Hall of Fame. In 2003, Street and Smith magazine named him one of the 100 most important college basketball players ever. And you see him at Utah games, and he's an ardent Utah supporter. The Lewis brothers came back. They didn't come back. Bob Lewis played in the NCAA tennis tournament the following year, went in the service, then they've continued on as engineers and had successful lives. Dick Smewen reported for military duty the day after he got home from the tournament. He served on the light cruiser Biloxi, was sitting 4 floors below the surface of the ship when it was struck by a Japanese bomb that was dropped. It landed right next to him and didn't go off. Came back and was a high school coach at Cypress High School for many, many years, and he died in 2001. And Josh, I think, wants to talk about just another couple of players, and then a little bit about the legacy that we feel this leaves.
Fred Sheffield, the jumper, he went on to have an illustrious career in NCAA track and field, first place, second place, third place in various events in the NCAA. He was offered to play for several pro teams after college, played with the Philadelphia Warriors before studying physical medicine and rehab, and his career was spent in the Army at Walter Reed. He passed away in 2008. Herb Wilkinson played a few games for the Lakers, but due to a disagreement about playing on Sundays, he decided to pursue other interests. He studied oral surgery and did that for many years. He's retired now and is still actively involved in the senior games in the high jump, long jump, shot put, discus, javelin, and standing long jump, and holds several world records in some of those events. Watt, as you may have heard, was drafted to play for the New York Knickerbockers in '47. And after they beat Kentucky, Watt, Arnie, and Dick returned to the University of Utah in 1947 and beat Kentucky in the final round of the NIT. Watt, afterward, after '44, he spent a few years in the service and went to Japan and worked as a translator, interviewing survivors of the attacks on Hiroshima. It was the first time he had returned to the land of his heritage. It was a struggle for him, but he came back to Utah and had a career as an engineer, and has lived a quiet life. He started a bowling league after being denied entrance into a whites-only bowling league, and was inducted into the Japanese American Bowling Hall of Fame also. He still lives in Battlefield, just a few blocks away from my wife and I. Go ahead, and we're going to skip a few frames because keep going. It's going to start. There we go. Okay, keep going, keep going. There was, let's see, one more time. Yeah, we kind of talk a lot, sorry. Keep going. Okay, this bas-relief sculpture used to be located in the Einar Nelson Fieldhouse, but when it was renovated a few years back, they took it and set it up against the side of the building when it started to rain, and this was made of plaster. Unfortunately, it did not survive the rainstorm. But that reminder of the great championships from 44 and 47, it still exists in the hearts and minds of people around here. And our hope is that in the future, as I mentioned earlier, we've sold the movie rights to the book, and the movie there's a screenplay been written, it's in pre-production. As part of that, we're hoping to raise funds to recreate this sculpture, not out of plaster, next time something a little bit more waterproof, as a lasting monument to the great deeds that they did those years. A bunch of kids who came together and didn't know better that they weren't able to do these great things and became champions. We're very grateful for the opportunity to share this great story with you. And if you have enjoyed it, we do bring a few books. But more than anything, we hope that you take this story with you and remember it and tell your kids and your grandkids so that we can all remember the amazing things that this team accomplished.